Welcome to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I am delighted to be here with all of you today and to welcome Sarah Anderson, who is one of the exciting new voices that has risen up in the space of depolarization, political conflict, and faith. And so she has a book coming up that I am really excited to invite her to share with all of us, and just a lot of good ideas on this subject. And so welcome, Sarah.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm so happy you're here. I was telling Sarah a few minutes ago that I'm especially excited about her as a guest because I feel like there's an odd absence in at least a lot of depolarization work of a really deeply faith-based voice, when obviously most people of faith, I think, would agree that faith has a lot of relevance to these problems. And so, Sarah, I'm wondering if you could start by just sharing a little bit about yourself and how you came to this work. And also, I assume you agree with what I just said, but any thoughts that you have on it? And if of course, if I'm way off, tell me that too.
Yeah. So I grew up just outside of Washington, D.C. in Northern Virginia in Fairfax. And I come from a very politically involved family. So both of my parents moved to D.C. out of college, and they met working at the Republican National Committee.
Oh, wow.
So in the early 70s, that's
Aww.
where they met, a political fairy tale, we like to joke.
Yep.
So they got married, and my mom worked for a Republican congresswoman up until my younger brother was born. And my dad continued to work in politics, worked on the Reagan campaign and then the Reagan administration as Undersecretary of Education and then Chief Domestic Policy Advisor to the President. And so their political experience really shaped my formative years growing up, that we were kind of all in, we were all Republican, we were very much kind of in that fold. And we were involved enough in the political scene that we got all the perks, right? Like you got to go to the White House Easter egg roll and the parades, but none of the really bad stuff. There wasn't a real sense of how ugly politics could get until I got a little bit older and became a little bit more aware of it. And then even more so when in my senior year of high school, my dad decided to run for president himself. So that really changed our experience of the political world.
I bet. Goodness.
He threw his hat into the ring for the Republican nomination. That was in 1999. So that was for the Republican, or for the 2000 election. Obviously, George W. Bush got the nomination. There was no presidency. But that experience really shaped me in terms of, I kind of understood the team dynamics growing up in DC, that there was team Democrat and team Republican. But when my dad ran and it was Republicans against other Republicans in the primary season, there was a real sense of infighting, and it was, people on your own team. And that really bothered me because it seemed like these were the people that we should be locking arms with, that we were going head to head with. And then everybody was just supposed to forget how vicious you were to each other at the convention. So I think it could have been timing with my age, being a senior in high school, just all of that. I'm probably more sensitive than other people in my family to how that felt. But I just wanted to get as far away from DC as possible and really remove myself from the political process as much as I could.
I hear you.
But then in college, my college experience and a few years after that, I just started to see that maybe the way that I had experienced the world wasn't the only way to experience the world, right? So I'd only ever been familiar with Team Republican, and I went to a very small conservative Christian college where I thought everybody else was Republicans, because Christian equals Republican.
Because obviously,
right, that's the world. And I remember seeing a poster for the Young Democrats Club across campus and being like, we have Democrats? Like, I don't understand what this is mind blowing. So that really kind of created this crack in my worldview, that there was more than one way to follow Jesus, and it wasn't just as a Republican. And then my experience kind of moving to Atlanta, and my husband's experience at a church, my experience in ministry world, we just started to learn more and more stories and realizing the things that once seemed very binary, and that this was right or this was wrong, or this was the right side, this was the wrong side, suddenly looked a lot more nuanced and kind of muddied the waters for us a little bit, how we understood politics. And then in addition to that, my understanding of politics started to change, and my family's didn't. And so there is this
Oh,
worry that if I change my mind on some things,
right.
what would that do to my relationship with my
Yep.
family? So I wrote this book, The Space Between Us, to basically kind of detail my experience with my family, how we
Mm-hmm.
kind of learned how to honor one another and respect
Mm-hmm.
one another in our varying positions when we didn't land on the
Mm-hmm.
same page anymore, but
Mm-hmm.
how the relationship took precedence,
Mm-hmm.
no matter what, and just kind of how we failed forward in some ways. We didn't always get it right. We're still learning how to do this. It isn't
Uh-huh.
always, great and easy.
Right.
But just kind of what we've learned in the process of what do you do when you value the relationship more than you do the position the other person
Mm-hmm.
holds, what that looks
Mm-hmm.
like.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. I love that. I didn't mention this to you, but I actually relate to that in the other direction, in that I grew up atheist and in a very religious community, and so was actually pretty anti-religion um, because my family wasn't always treated well as the only atheist people
Mm,
around. And so I went to school to get as far away from religion as possible, basically,
yeah.
on the East Coast. And but I met people there who were a different kind of Christian and a different kind of Jewish person.
Yeah.
And then I slowly, it's a whole story, but I have come back to being a person of faith.
Yeah.
Not come back, but like that's where I've landed.
Yeah.
And that has been very complicated. And that has also come with a political shift.
Mm,
I identify as a red
mhm.
but I grew up liberal.
Yeah.
And that has similarly caused, it's challenging. And I like that when you describe the way that that has worked out with your family. First, I love your phrase of prioritizing the relationship over the position.
Mhm.
And also, I like that you're acknowledging the fact that it's still not like perfect. Like, it's not like every conversation goes to a good place. They don't all,
Right.
but that like on the whole, you
Yeah.
found a way to hang together. And I'm wondering just if you would share a story or two from that journey. Like, what has that been like? How have you, what's like an example of
Yeah.
a way that you've like wrestled and then found a way to stay in relationship?
Yeah. I would say that in this situation, grandkids have been the biggest blessing in the world,
Ah,
because
uh-huh.
what we try to do, and out loud or not, is really look for the lowest common denominator that we share in common.
Mm,
So
mm-hmm.
it's, even if we can't land on the same page with a view on a particular issue, we can all agree that I'm wanting the best possible America for my kids, and they're
Right.
wanting the best possible America for their grandkids. And how that might
Absolutely.
look, and how that plays out is going to potentially look different. But we
Yeah.
can agree they're not bad people. And I'm
Right.
not a bad person because we think we
Mm-hmm.
get there in a different way. When I
Yeah.
see that they're looking out for the best interests of my kids, just in a
Mm-hmm.
different way, I can respect that and I can honor that.
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes it's remembering that shared goal,
Mm-hmm.
how we get to that goal might look differently. But I will say, there are definitely conversations that don't go well, and that we
Yeah.
have to take a step back and learning how to read the emotional cues in the room. Like, when is this
Uh-huh.
going to be a dialogue, and when is this,
Right.
when are we like
Yeah.
looking to just kind of start something, and when is this, what, like, let's talk
Mm-hmm.
about this another time when we're all more rested and
Right.
have eaten, we're not like hangry, like
Yes.
there's a better
After
time and
dinner.
place for this. So
Mm-hmm.
just kind of paying attention to the cues in the room. But for me, it really is coming down to what's the lowest common denominator that we share? What can we
Mm-hmm.
always come back around to that reminds me you're not a bad person, I'm not a
Right.
bad person.
Right.
We share a common goal. We're just going to get there a little bit differently.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I'm sure that, you've done that this stuff from your book research, but the thing you just named of that you're not a bad person, like that's one of the nasty things about polarization right now is that that's called affective polarization, right? Is like
Mhm.
and that kind is on the rise, that it's not just that I
Yeah.
disagree, it's that I think you're a bad person. And I want to I guess this might seem like a kind of risky question, but I want to ask. I think that the President Trump really made that issue more challenging for folks. I don't know where you come down on President Trump or where your family does or whatever, but like I know that for a lot of folks, it was a lot easier to say, well, you support Bush, but you're not a bad person, than you support Trump, but you're not a bad person. And uh, that says maybe more about the speaker than the listener. But in
Right.
any case, I'm just curious, since he's such a polarizing figure, how has that affected things for you guys?
Yeah, it was challenging. It was a challenging
Mm-hmm.
4 years. I had family closely connected in the administration and
Mm.
working in the administration, and it was really difficult sometimes to have some of these conversations. I
Yeah.
remember at the end of my book, I include a liturgy that I wrote
Mm.
for my family going into the
Wow.
Thanksgiving of 2016, after that
Oh.
election had happened. That was just a reminder for myself. I wrote it for myself, and then ended up, my husband was like, you need to share this with your family.
Mm.
But it was for that idea of remembering that our differences don't need to be things that separate us, that we can have
Mm-hmm.
very real differences of opinion on the president, on
Mm-hmm.
the policies, on the
Mm-hmm.
tone of how
Yeah.
things are being talked about.
Mm-hmm.
But our differences don't need to be liabilities. And that
Mm-hmm.
ultimately, I believe that our differences make for a better experience in the world, right? And so
Absolutely.
just learning to see that the complications aren't a bad thing, that
Uh-huh.
that what connected me to my family remains true, and was
Mm-hmm.
true before 2016 and is true
Mm-hmm.
after 2020,
Mm-hmm.
and that
Mm-hmm.
there's a much stronger foundation than just who that current president was. And that isn't to say that there weren't very real disagreements on how
Oh
things were
yeah.
handled. So I would say there were some conversations that were probably shied away from in that 4 years, to
Yeah.
knowing that no one's interested in changing anybody's minds. Um,
Mm.
so is it a good idea to really go there if we know we're not
Right.
really there?
Yeah.
Sometimes we did, for better or for worse. but
Yeah.
remembering that there was something that connected us far before that, far before
Yeah.
Trump was president and long after Trump was president,
Mm-hmm.
that we were a
Mm-hmm.
family unit.
Very much so. One of the things that I have thought I've been thinking about recently, that I feel like people who have family on the other side in a big way maybe are particularly well suited to I don't know, learn about or offer or something. I've been thinking about how I think that uh, sort of the best form, or a really good form of what it looks like to be a depolarizer or a braver angel, or to follow in the footsteps or teachings of Christ, or whatever religious figure, is to not only be able to say, I see that you disagree and I know that you're not a bad person, but sometimes I find it's possible to go a step farther and say, and that thing which makes you disagree with me so much, I love that about you. I don't like where it takes you, but I love that about you. So
Yeah.
for example, and I think that people with family on the other side, the benefit is we really know the other person, right? And so you can say, it's your independence that like makes you not want the government in your business, or it's the fact that you're really compassionate, and I would almost say to a fault, and that's why you support these policies, right? Da, 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 da.
Right.
And I'm interested just if you've and so I know that I have found that
Yeah.
in my family, that like the way that they believe in justice, particularly on economics, is something I really admire. I don't always like come to the same policy conclusions,
Right.
but like,
Right.
but it's the things that cause us to disagree are actually things I can appreciate about them.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious if that like resonates with you, if you found anything like that.
Yeah, I have. To me, again, as a person of faith, it really comes
Mm-hmm.
down to a fundamental thing for me, not just as a Christian, but with the a Jewish perspective as well, that we're all image bearers of our Creator, and so
Mm-hmm.
I bear an image of the Creator, but you bear an image that I would not know something about God
Mm-hmm.
unless I got to know these parts of you, that you're revealing something to me about the Creator of this world and this universe and all the different cultures and ethnicities. And there's
Mm-hmm.
so much to learn, and that it would be very arrogant of me to think that only knowing myself and only knowing people from my perspective makes me think that I understand who God is or what God is like. But instead, I should be leaning into people who are different from me because they've got something to teach me about God. And if I consider
Absolutely.
myself to be a person of faith, then I should be wondering more about you, not shutting the door to you, but seeing that as an invitation.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost as a spiritual practice, right? Like this isn't a
Mm-hmm.
political practice, but it's a spiritual practice to want to learn more about you and to
Mm-hmm.
see what you reveal to me about who I think God is.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, just love it. I actually have thought often that Braver Angels teaches spiritual skills. We obviously don't talk about it that way, and
Right.
there are folks who wouldn't wouldn't use that language ever, but like, I actually do think that like it's not just about sort of logical or practical or analytical skills. There's something much deeper going on.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so let's talk about your faith for a second. Can you just share a little bit about like your background? I don't know if you're from a particular denomination or what kinds of churches you've gone to.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I grew up going to a Baptist church in Northern Virginia. And then when I went into middle school, my family started attending a Bible church. So it was a non-denominational, evangelical, probably more Reformed theology, down that path. And I went to a PCA, Presbyterian Church of America college. And then I moved to Georgia and was on staff, and my husband now is on staff at the same church. I'm not there anymore, working, another non-denominational church that was probably came from the Baptist tradition, but is very evangelical, non-denominational in practice. So kind of been all over the place.
Yeah,
a lot of different,
it's a good sample.
Yeah, a lot of sampling, but I love to read people from all different kinds of traditions, a lot of contemplatives, mystics, liturgical practices. I like, I didn't grow up with any of the liturgy. So I love now the idea of, doing a sort of Lent practice, Advent, that type of thing. Just, I think there's so much to be learned. I think a lot of us are, reactionary to what we grew up with. So my reaction is to be infiltrated with the liturgical side of things. But, I think like a lot of people of faith, there's, just kind of this growing and or it should be a growing and evolving of things. And, the faith that I practiced at 16 was different than the faith I practiced at 26, which is different than the faith I practice now. So that there's this constant evolving and, hopefully humility and figuring out the more I learn, the more I don't know, and wanting to see people from all different kinds of traditions, Christian or not. How can you be my teacher? What can I learn from you and your faith experience that I may have missed because of how I grew up or where I grew up?
Sure. Yeah, that's wonderful. This is probably silly, but as somebody, so like I said, I came from a very non-religious background. I didn't know what the word liturgy was until recently. So would you just explain that, and also sort of the high church, low church thing, and how all that maps?
Great. That's a great question. I forget. My husband and I are both so in church world. This is like, these are terms we use all the time.
Most listeners know this, but I didn't. And so I'm just, if anybody's out there like me, a
high church would probably be like Catholic, Anglican, Episcopalian. So there's set readings, set scripture passages that you go through. Every, church that's on the same liturgical kind of calendars teaching from the same passages every Sunday. Non-denominational there's different forms of preaching there, but you can either pick a book of the Bible and go through that, or it can be a topic based, but there's a lot more kind of freedom around that. So the liturgy for me, there's different times of the year leading up to Christmas and leading up to Easter, where there's certain passages of scripture I like to read and go through practice. The 40 days leading up to Easter, is there something to give up? Is there something to kind of be more focused on when it comes to Jesus and his suffering and identifying with him in those 40 days before practicing resurrection on Easter Sunday. So I would say that's probably my very unpolished description.
Totally. No, that's perfect. That's perfect. Yeah. Yeah. And so tell me about how you apply all of this to take us to polarization. Like, how do you get into that, where those two things intersect? Well, let's start with that.
Well, I would say, when it comes to polarization, how I see it is we have a growing gap between our positions and our ideas and the things that we hold, and the people on both sides, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think it's something to be cognizant of. What is worrisome to me is not just the growing gap, but the growing tendency to be disrespectful and dishonoring, and then ultimately dehumanizing towards the groups and the individuals on the other side of that gap from where you are. So to me, the polarization is showing up there, that it's not just we're having less and less in common with one another, but we're seeing a real tendency to other one another, see someone so different. that we allow bad treatment of them. And I see that this is bad in any circumstances.
Of course.
I think this is particularly dangerous in religious circles, and where we tend to see it maybe even more, because I think we saw a lot in 2016. The identification with a particular party was almost a litmus test for belonging into a faith community.
Right.
So it was kind of like, if you want to belong here in this faith community, you have to ascribe to this political party or these positions, which I don't think that's a great idea. But on top of that, I think we can move very easily into the idea of thinking that God is on our side, and use God as a sort of, pardon the expression, trump card when it comes to thinking that if God believes me on this, that means he's against the other side. If God is present on my team, that means he's absent from the other team. And you don't have to look very far in history to see where that's taken us when it comes to silencing, violence, genocide, Holocaust. As soon as we begin to think that we've cornered the market on God and God is on our team, it allows us to get away with all kinds of really bad behavior in God's name. And that's what is so dangerous to me. Again, this is dangerous in any area, but we have to be especially cognizant of it in the religious world, because ultimately, I mean, that's taking God's name in vain, right? That's assigning to him something that he have nothing to do with, but saying that we can get away with it. And ultimately, I think that leads to lazy thinking politically, but also lazy thinking religiously. If we just think that God is on our team, I don't have to think critically about any position, because I think God's a Republican, so I'm just going to vote a Republican.
That's right. Yeah.
So I think it
Only
really
that easy.
It leads to just a lot of lazy intellectual thinking, politically, religiously. And so I just think that's a really dangerous road to go down. So what I want to do is be able to talk more about the way that there is more than one way to follow Jesus in the world. And I think that you can make a case for saying Jesus would vote Republican, and you can make a case for saying Jesus would vote Democrat. And I am not going to put Jesus in a box one way or the other.
Absolutely.
And that if I spend any amount of time in the Gospels, I see that Jesus ticks people off on all sides. So
he sure does.
If I think that I've got him figured out, it means I've probably made him too small. And I've probably made him into my image instead of me being conformed into his. And that's something that, you know, as a follower of Jesus, I need to be very cognizant of and pay a lot of attention.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, it reminds me, I can't quote this sort of perfectly, but I feel like I saw a few years ago an attempt to map Jesus on that like political compass, right? Like it's libertarian or whatever. And what they said was that ultimately he comes down as far right on some things, far left on others. So like no divorce, so far right on some things, far left, give up your belongings and give them to the poor and follow me, right? Like he just like he's by our sort of metrics all over the place. And you know, that speaks to the difficult and complex nature of truth and of him. And I love what you said about making him small, right? That we don't, that's a real risk, I think. And it's so easy, right? As humans who are like, I read the book, I think I understand it. And I'm curious, how do you base this in scripture? Like, what are some of the particular groundings that you use?
Yeah. Well, I try to pay a lot of attention to the Gospels. I think the interactions and the stories that Jesus tells, and then the stories of the people that he interacts with is very telling to me. Because I think we could have had a situation where he came and gave us a list of rules to follow and called it a day. And that was it, you know? But what we see instead are 4 different accounts of 4 different ways of telling Jesus's life, all in the Bible. And the way that he interacted with people, it often left people more confused than clear on what he was like. And that says something to me, right? A lot of people, he was asked so many questions, and then he answered very few of them. He responded by asking more questions. And so it seems to me that there's so much more in the back and forth and the dialogue and the treatment of the person than the position that the person was holding. When I think of the way that he treated people, he didn't have a hard time with sinners. He had a harder time with people who thought they weren't sinners, right? So there seemed to be the people who lacked the self-awareness. That was who had a hard time with what Jesus was like. So to me, it's really kind of embracing who are the people that were drawn to him, and who were the people that he was drawn to in terms of was able to have a relationship and a back and forth. When it comes to principles for how this plays out in specific issues, I think, again, Jesus was more concerned with how to be in the world as opposed to what to think in the world. And so I want to pay a lot of attention to, what he said was the greatest commandment, loving the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. And then saying the second is like it, equating loving God with loving your neighbor as yourself. So that needs to be the litmus test for me. I want to pay attention to actual issues and actual policies. But if I am diminishing the humanity of the person holding the position that I don't like, then I'm disobeying the commandment that Jesus said was most important. So I want to make sure that that's kind of the litmus test for me. Again, being thoughtful and being intentional about the positions I land on, but caring way more about what is the emotional temperature between me and the person holding the opposing view. That matters far more. I think also, in the Beatitudes, a Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talks about, goes through a list of blessed are the, and lists several things. And the thing that keeps coming to mind in these kinds of complicated, times we're living in is blessed are the peacemakers. And he says they should be called the children of God. And to me, I think we have a tendency of doing one of two things when it comes to peace. We have a tendency of thinking we can force peace, just make everybody think the way we want them to think, bully them into submission, or we can keep peace and pretend that there really aren't, the differences aren't that big of a deal.
Yes.
So Jesus says to make peace, it's saying we've got to find a third way. It's too easy to just land on one side or the other. It takes a lot more work and a lot more intentionality to bring the best of both sides into a middle way, a narrow way, if you want to talk about scripture, this narrow road of creating a third way and doing that kind of work. That to me is what I think, those are the principles that really influence and kind of color the way that I want to have this conversation with people. Not saying that it goes that well all the time, because I have opinions, on positions, but when it comes down to it, if I'm not sure what to do, I want to default to love of the person. Even if I can't love their position, I can love the person in the position.
Absolutely. I just love what you're saying. And we have he's on the podcast sometimes. We have one of our co-founders, a guy named David Lapp. I don't think he'd mind if I quoted this. He said this in an internal meeting, but there have been a lot of debates recently about, are some positions too far beyond the pale? Because they're, especially after the Capitol storming, there were a lot of calls for to have certain people be declared not part of the community, or at least certain positions. And David Lapp, this co-founder of ours, his answer was very simple. We all went around in the staff meeting and said where we are on this and what we feel about it and all that. And he I think said, he talked for the shortest amount of time, but what he said was, well, I think about Jesus, and Jesus didn't say, persuade the prostitute out of her ways, persuade the tax collector out of his ways. He just went and spent time with the prostitute and loved the tax collector and said, come in. And I think that there is something that is both radical and worth really seriously considering there, just around litmus tests. And I understand that there is also a need in politics is a power game to some degree. But I think society doesn't have to be, and there has to be some level at which we unconditionally accept people. And so you're just making me think of him. And the thing you said about peacemaking, I especially love. I might actually steal that from you, or paraphrase it or something, and give credit, of course. But the reason is that so Braver Angels has a bunch of different kinds of work, offerings. I run the debate program, and the reason is that I believe really strongly in truth and reconciliation, like both of those things. And I feel like it's very easy for people who are ostensibly peacemakers to want to do one or the other of those things. But as you're saying, peace is something that has to be made. It isn't just there, right? Like if it was there, we wouldn't have all this controversy. So I like that very much. And I just appreciate that. I'm interested in what the reception has been. So how do you share this with, I suppose it's probably pretty similar, but like, I assume you give talks at churches. I've seen some of your interviews. Like, what questions do people ask? How do they respond in faith communities specifically?
Well, I will say I self-published my book because it was too conservative for conservative Christian publishers and not, or wasn't conservative enough for conservative publishers, and it wasn't liberal enough for liberal publishers.
I believe you.
I think that probably answers your question in that it makes a lot of people mad. It doesn't go far enough in either direction to a lot of people who on both sides, which is what I expected. So there has been pushback, but I think the people who have gotten the most out of it and have received it the best and have followed up with me, I guess I should say, are the people who had individual family members who they literally were watching relationships disintegrate before their eyes and were feeling very hopeless about what to do. Kind of mend it. So I think at the end of the day, it was the people who felt like there was a big personal cost if they didn't get this right. And people who felt like they were only surrounded by people who are just like them, then they could, there wasn't a need for it. They could write it off and discount it for any number of reasons. But the people who were literally watching the divide take their family apart, found that they were able to have conversations and at least salvage some humanity and some dignity in the conversation. And so those are the stories that mean the most to me. And that honestly was the point of the book. So I'm fine if it's, not far enough left. They are not far enough right either way. They tell you not to read your 1 and 2 star reviews. Of course you read them anyway.
Very hard not to.
So I'm like, how do you not do this? But of course it literally is people on both ends of the spectrum saying it wasn't enough. Which I'm going, I guess you didn't
condemn them.
That's right. So I'm like, I guess that's what I wanted to do. So the people who it resonated with were the people who've had something on the line if it didn't figure this out. So I would say it's been received very well by those individuals, and by some people it was not far enough or too far.
Interesting. That is really interesting. And I agree with you that gives us a little picture of like the country right now, not just any particular community. And I haven't decided if this is a good or bad thing, but I do think that there are a lot of families it's a tragedy, but for these purposes I don't think there are a lot of people who have that pain point, because families are one of the only groups in society that's still strong, where like you're going to have just everybody in there, right? You're going to have this kind of crazy person and that kind of quirk, and like it's all there at the dinner table on Thanksgiving.
It's so interesting. Thanksgiving right after election day. Every time it's going to come right after election day. And I heard from so many people that were literally saying, my family's not getting together after we've canceled Thanksgiving. And it wasn't just because of COVID. I mean, COVID may have been, an
easier.
But it was, we can't be in the same room because of what happened on election night, or because of what didn't happen on election night. And it just, it's heartbreaking to me. But I think you're right. I think that's the reality for a lot of people. And we can really pick our people in every other scenario, but you can't pick your family, and you're kind of forced to have to
exactly. You're stuck with them. Yep. Totally. I'm interested in how you talk about. So first of all, do you see parallels in other faith traditions? Like, is there anybody who's written like the Muslim version of this book, or like other ones? And then also how you engage your secular audience with this angle.
I I would say I think Judaism does this very well, and since it's the parent religion to Christianity, that makes sense. I think Judaism does this better than Christianity in a lot of ways, because there is a sense of mystery around God and a sense of question asking, and there's a posture of humility and wrestling with ideas that is part of Judaism. I think Christians can tend to get a bad rap. Well, maybe when they've earned that we've cornered the market on truth, we have it figured out, this is the way it is. There's no room for, tell me what your experience has been, help me see things from your perspective, because we think we've got the absolute situation going on. But I think because Judaism is based so much on this idea of wrestling with God, I really draw a lot from that. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs passed away at the end of 2020, but his books, The Dignity of Difference, and there's another one of his that I love, but these, I feel like he really brings his Jewish tradition into understanding this idea of there is a dignity in our differences, and that I can learn from what you bring to the table, and that the answer is not sameness and conformity, but in honoring the things that we don't have in common. So I'm sure that there are many other examples and lots of other traditions, faith traditions. But I would say I think I find more from the Jewish tradition right now than I do from the Christian tradition, in terms of finding
interesting,
just a posture, I guess, towards learning. I think that's probably what I get more from the Jewish tradition right now. And when it comes to secular audiences, I think for people of faith, this is an imperative. This is something I don't think we get a pass on learning how to do this. But I think for secular audiences, this message is true if you are in a close relationship with anybody, any family member, coworker, friends, whoever it might be, and you want to be a better citizen of humanity. I think this message is important. And to me, it is that posture of humility and of learning, of thinking, I might not have it all figured out. And if that's true, you might know more than I do. And I might need to change my mind about something, which is, the idea of repentance is changing our minds. I think we've walked away from that as Christians a little bit, but I think we've got to open ourselves up culturally to the idea of there being more to learn. There being more to consider, and then maybe changing our positions on those things when we do. Adam Grant just came out with his book, Think Again. This idea, it's not a religious book, but it's the idea of be willing to think and rethink what you've taken in, what you've always held to be true, and consider that there's another way. There's another way of seeing the world. So, Catherine Schultz did a TED Talk about, she asked her audience about what it feels like to be wrong about something. And, she had people yelling answers out saying it's embarrassing and it's humiliating and all these different things. And she said, no, that's what it feels like when you've discovered you're wrong. Being wrong and not knowing it feels a lot like being right. And I think anybody, again, not a Christian, speaker, right, or whatever, but someone who is willing to say, all of us hold the positions we hold because we think we're right, but what if we're wrong? And I think having that position allows us to enter relationships and enter dialogues where there's polarization and a lot more of a humble way, and a lot more of a humble posture. So I think that's true for anybody. I think if you want to be a good human and see the culture change and move in this direction, I think it matters. You can attach Jesus' name to it or not, but I think the principles still apply.
Absolutely. Yeah. I very much agree. I'm interested. So one part of me is listening to this from the ear of some of my more conservative Christian friends. I identify as a red, but there are, some of my friends who are way further down that road than I am. And I'm, how to phrase this? So I really appreciate the way that you're talking about humility. One of the things, and that's an essential virtue for the work that we do, and it's underrated in America today, and all of that. The blunt way to ask this or to say it is, but I don't want to have to apologize for my faith. I don't want to have to apologize for. Can you explain the difference between, or how you think about, like, I might be wrong, and and not taking a sort of submissive or apologetic attitude, because I do think that there are Christians haven't cornered the market on arrogance either, and so and so there are like stereotypes that like would paint those folks as, you know, dumb or backwards or whatever, and and so then I think people get the reaction of like, I don't want to have to apologize for this. I don't like the sort of cancel culture. You can't even talk about religion. So disentangle those for me.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think you're right. I think there is an automatic defensiveness, and rightfully so sometimes, that it can feel like we're being silenced for something that matters a lot to us, and we don't want to have to be apologetic for that. But I do think we can still hold very tightly to our convictions and our beliefs, and have a posture of wanting to learn, and not respond with a defensiveness, but respond with a, tell me more about why you're responding that way, right? It's a curiosity that it's not we're just going to like butt heads and whoever can come up with the best argument to this wins. But it's really, I want to be a student of your experience. But if we're coming at it from a defensive posture, I don't think we're ever really going to learn anything. But if we're coming at it as, I'm not, you know, I don't want to change my mind on anything, but I do want to better understand how you landed where you did. So help me understand that, you know, that I think it's very hard to, be aggressive in that way when you're really trying to be a student of the other person. And I don't think we should ever go into an interaction thinking we can change somebody's mind, because we don't have any control over that. And that's above our pay grade. Like, that's not something we can guarantee. What we can guarantee is going into an interaction with a willingness to want to understand the other person better. That is within our control. So I would say going in with that feels different. Even if you are still holding just as tightly to your beliefs, it feels different to the person on the other side of you when you're coming in with an attitude of, I want to understand you. I don't want to change you. I just want to understand you. That feels different to me. But, you know, I do talk about when in certain talks, and I talk about this in the book a little bit too, is figuring out what are our beliefs, convictions, and opinions, and figuring out what are the things that we are going to hold very tightly to that are worth kind of putting stakes in the ground for. Like, these are the things that are very identity shaping. Those are our beliefs. We have our convictions that we have strong feelings about, but we also know that other people have differing convictions and land somewhere else. And so even if we don't get it, we understand that people are like that. And then we have opinions that we can probably be talked in and out of on any, you know, whatever that issue is, or maybe it's an issue we don't know a lot about, and really kind of learning how to do an inventory about what are the things that are going to get our emotional energy. Because I think part of the problem right now is every hill is a hill to die on. We are emotionally invested in everything. And we literally don't know enough to be emotionally invested in everything.
That's right.
And, you know, we bring every opinion to the table. Eventually we become white noise, and nobody actually hears us about the things we really do care about. So learning to figure out what are the issues that you are committed to this. This is a thing you are not going to change your mind on. That doesn't mean you approach it with arrogance, but you're saying this is foundational to who I am, and I am not changing my mind. Means I might be able to let this debate go by, because I don't need to get engaged in this one, because that doesn't line up with my core, you know, what I think about that. And learning to, you don't have to attend every argument you're invited to. You can pass on some of them.
I like that. Yeah. You don't have to attend, even if, you know, your brother-in-law or whoever invites you
is inviting you consistently.
Yes, it's like, hello. Yes. Would you like to argue about this? I'm right here. Yeah, no, totally. Well, actually, that brings up, that's a perfect segue to one of the other questions I wanted to ask you, which is, so what about those serious issues, like the sort of poster child serious issue is abortion, right? Or what about, you know, marriage, or just some of the real deep issues where, like, there's a, basically, how do we follow Christ's example when there's a very serious issue, like something that isn't I don't want to say where it's, because it's not just that you're not going to change your mind, it's that it feels like there are serious moral stakes to whether people in society agree with this or not, right? So for abortion, that would be the lives of unborn children, or for marriage, it's, the sanctity of one of our most sacred and oldest traditions, or whatever. So how do we go to those conversations with this kind of, because is the and the answer is probably yes, but show me how. Do we still say, I have something to learn from you?
Yeah, I would say that we do. And I think there are very serious moral issues. So I don't want it to sound like everything's really just the same and it's fine.
Of course not. No.
I'm not saying that at all. But I do think sometimes, depending on the person you're talking to and where they land on the spectrum, the moral issue is about something different, right? So with the abortion issue, for someone who's leaning conservative, it's about the sanctity of life and the baby in the womb. For someone who's leaning left, they're talking about the moral issue of the woman, right? So I think when we frame it just as the moral issue based on how we see it, then it's easier to say that person is immoral for thinking the way they do because they don't see it this way, as opposed to doing a little bit of digging and figuring out, okay, chances are they think this is a moral issue too. They just see it as a different moral issue. So what is that? Or when it comes to climate change, it's if I'm wanting to make decisions to cut back on carbon emissions and this person doesn't, it's not because they hate the planet and they want to destroy it. There's a different issue that they're saying takes precedence over how I see it playing out. So I think it takes a little bit more work in figuring out there isn't just the one issue and you land moral, you land immoral. It's each side has decided to see the moral issue or being a different issue, right? And there's nuance in that. And again, I think that the conversations where you can have that, where you can figure that out about the other person, are the ones where you feel safe, where you where you can say, I don't see it that way. Help me understand how you see it that way. And you feel safe enough to maybe speak wrongly and not ruin, a relationship, but you have the freedom to misspeak, to misstep, to be corrected, to correct, to kind of really like wrestle this out. And I think that the wrestling is where you walk away with a greater respect for the other person. But I think you also walk away with a better understanding of how nuanced so many of these positions are. And I think that's a good thing. I think we need to be very careful that anytime we see something as a very black and white issue, we're probably missing something. So being willing to kind of wade into it and learn a little bit more than maybe what we were told or what we inherited, from family of origin or whatever it was, and there's probably more to it. It's probably not that 50% of the country is completely immoral because they disagree with this. You know what I mean?
Probably not, actually.
Probably.
Yes.
I mean,
although people sure think that, but yes.
Yeah. Right.
Right. If that's the case, we have a lot of problems. Yeah.
It's worse than we thought, if that's the case.
Yes. Yeah, totally. Well, so help me, I want to take this to a real practical level. So say that I, and this is true, like really agree with what, and feel like called towards what you're saying. How do I practice it? Because so one thing that I heard was, you don't have to take every invitation that's offered to you. But what about just on any given day when there isn't like when you're not like going to the in-laws to have your annual whatever, right? Like, what about in just a real day-to-day way?
Yeah. I think it starts with becoming aware of the echo chambers we live in. I think that we do, I think we live in some self-selected echo chambers, whether it's the people we hang out with, whatever that is, the people we follow on social media. But I think the social media piece, and Jonathan Haidt talks about this a lot, the algorithms that that kind of create the timelines that come across our news feed, all of these things play into it. So those are echo chambers that we haven't actively participated in, but we're living in, maybe even without our realizing it. So paying more attention to who are the people, who are the voices we're listening to, what's the news network we're getting our news from, I like to switch back and forth between several to get different perspectives on, even if one can infuriate me more than the other. It's important to know what half the country's hearing. I follow Ground News is an app I have on my phone that tells you whatever the news story is. It'll tell you this is how people on the right are reporting it. This is how people on the left are reporting it. And it's just will give you an idea of, this was a blind spot the left had about this story. This is a blind spot the right had. And we'll just lay it out for you. And just being aware that we are not completely rational creatures who sometimes make emotional decisions, that we are emotional creatures who sometimes make rational decisions. And being
I love that. Yep.
That we are so influenced by the stuff that comes across our screen, by the people that we surround ourselves with, and trying to really build in practices of self-awareness, being able to be with people who are not like us and asking them, having kind of relationship with them, that where you can say, what am I missing about myself on this issue? Is there something you can point out to me that's a blind spot to me when it comes to this issue? I would say don't, make a new friend by saying, who'd you vote for in this last election? Like, don't just dive in there. But, if you haven't talked about politics before, I've told people start by talking local politics, things that don't, as he did, start with these like more down to, closer to home kind of issues. You can talk back and forth about that. But just finding the spaces and the people where you feel safe enough to learn, and for people to learn from you. I think, that's the idea. Safe space can get a bad rap, but I think that's true when it comes to relationships and talking about
very much so
emotional issues. So I would say pay attention to the people that you follow and the people that you surround yourself with, and paying attention when you want to have the conversation. Paying attention to all the different variables that might make the conversation go sideways, right? So if you're a family member, realizing there's probably some baggage that comes to the relationship, and how will that play out in this conversation? What is the emotional temperature in the room? Like, everybody get a good night's sleep last night? Is anybody tired? What are is there a baby crying in the background? Like, what's going to make this not go well? And paying attention and leaning into those cues. But I think, so much of it is doing an inventory on ourselves before we, kind of seek that out in somebody else. Do we have the posture to learn? Do we have a willingness to say that maybe we're wrong? Are we reading books by people and opinions of people that we don't see eye to eye with, and how do they land there? Just being willing to be a learner, have a beginner's mind when it comes to politics, religion, all the issues that we think we've nailed down in our opinion on them, and just being willing to maybe see things differently.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, so if it's okay with you, I would actually love to close with prayer. But because I can't stand the idea of naming our Twitter hashtag and all that after prayer, to do that first. Just as a sort of the formal thank you, and then we'll actually end with a prayer. I just want to thank everybody who's been listening today, and thank you, Sarah, for being here with us. It's been wonderful. For those of you who don't already, we would love it if you would, of course, like and share us on social media. Website is braverangels.org. Our Twitter and all of our social media handles are Braver Angels, as you might imagine. And Sarah, would you just share with us again the title of your book and where we can get a copy?
Yeah, it's called The Space Between Us, How Jesus Teaches Us to Live Together When Politics and Religion Pull Us Apart. And you can find it on Amazon and barnesandnoble.com. And I think there's a couple of used bookstore sites that you can find it too if you don't want to support the big
if that's your issue, yes.
So, yes.
Yeah, fabulous. Okay, great. And so I think what would be delightful is I will start, and then if you just want to sort of pick up when I go quiet, and then you can wrap us up, that would be great. Is that all right?
Sounds good.
All right. God, I ask that you would bless our country in these moments, and particularly the families, Sarah's family, my family, and all those families across the country, and friendships and other kinds of relationships that are really, really facing a test right now. And I ask that you would help people just take a minute and have grace for themselves first. And I ask that you would just be gentle with them and help them be gentle with themselves, and give them the heart and the openness to see again who they're talking to, and to remember who that person is. And I just ask that you would bless us as we go through what is turning into a painful many years with regard to these political divisions.
God, we are grateful for a season and a time of the year where we are reminded of your humanity and the lengths that you went to walk with us, to experience pain and heartbreak and hurt leading up to your death and resurrection. You know how difficult it is to be human. And a lot of us are feeling the tension in our human relationships and pain and hurt, maybe not in a physical way, but in an emotional and relational way. And I just thank you that we are praying to you as a God who is with us and who is not unfamiliar with suffering. So I thank you for meeting us in that pain, physical or otherwise. And God, we just pray for the people who are looking for a way forward, who are looking to find a kind of resurrection in their relationships with family members and friends, who are wanting to be hopeful, but are finding it difficult to be. And God, we just pray that you would give them courage and give them love and give them your peace, and help all the people who are wanting and willing to do the grassroots work of relationship building and relationship repair, to know that they are doing the difficult work, and that even if we don't see the fruit of it right away, that we are doing the work that will ultimately bring restoration to our families and to the world. And God, we just pray that on the days when it's hard to remember, that we would look for your image in the people most unlike us, and that we would look for opportunities to celebrate it and to not despise it in the people most unlike us. Thank you for what you've given us in your love and in your example. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you to all our listeners. This has been the Braver Angels podcast. Tune in again soon.